Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise, or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Not only did Berenice successfully overthrow her own father and rule Egypt for 3 years, but she also made decisions that would directly shape the rise of her younger sister Cleopatra. Every power move Cleopatra later made, every alliance she formed, every strategy she used to seduce Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, it all traces back to lessons learned from watching Berenice's dramatic rise and fall. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is it possible that we all know Cleopatra's name, but hardly anyone has heard of Berenice? Well, that's because history is written by the victors, and Berenice's story was deliberately buried by those who came after her. But today, I'm going to uncover the truth about the sister who took Cleopatra's throne. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why Berenice IV might actually be the most fascinating woman in ancient Egyptian history. Let me paint you a picture. The year is 58 BCE. Alexandria, the greatest city in the ancient world, is buzzing with tension. The massive lighthouse towers over a harbour filled with ships from across the Mediterranean. The famous library holds the wisdom of centuries. But inside the royal palace, something sinister is brewing. Ptolemy XII, known as Orleats, or the flute player, sits uneasily on the throne of Egypt. He's not called the flute player because he's musical. No, it's actually a mocking nickname given to him by his own people because they see him as weak, ineffective, a ruler who dances to the tune of Rome rather than commanding respect as a true pharaoh should. And his daughter Berenice is watching. She's in her early 20s, intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely furious with what she sees as her father's betrayal of Egyptian independence. While Ptolemy bows and scrapes before Roman senators, Berenice is quietly building alliances with the most powerful nobles in Alexandria. She's studying the political landscape, learning who can be trusted and who can be bought. But this isn't just a story about political maneuvering. This is deeply personal. Because in the Ptolemaic family, power struggles weren't just about politics, they were about survival. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries by this point, ever since Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy claimed the kingdom after Alexander's death. And they had maintained their power through a simple but brutal family tradition. They married their siblings to keep the bloodline pure, and they eliminated anyone who posed a threat to their rule. So when Berenice looks at her father, she doesn't just see a weak king. She sees a man who's endangering the entire dynasty, who's making Egypt vulnerable to Roman conquest, who's betraying everything their ancestors fought to build. And she knows that if she doesn't act, Egypt might lose its independence forever. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Berenice isn't some naive princess playing at politics. She's been trained from childhood in the art of royal intrigue. The Ptolemaic court was like a masterclass in manipulation, alliance building, and strategic thinking. Every conversation was a chess move, every friendship was potentially a weapon, and every family dinner could be your last. Picture this scene. It's a typical evening in the palace. The royal family is dining together in their private quarters, surrounded by golden statues of their ancestors, and served by dozens of slaves. The room smells of exotic spices and perfumed oils. Ptolemy is discussing his latest negotiations with Roman officials, explaining how he's secured Egypt's position by agreeing to various concessions. But Berenice isn't really listening to his words. She's watching his body language, noting which courtiers nod approvingly and which ones exchange skeptical glances. She's mentally cataloguing who might support her if she were to make a move against him, and sitting across from her is young Cleopatra, probably around 10 years old at this time, observing everything with those famously intelligent eyes. What Cleopatra is witnessing in these moments will shape her entire approach to power. She's learning that in the Ptolemaic family, loyalty is conditional, that strength is respected above all else, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from within your own household. Every lesson Berenice is about to teach through her actions will influence how Cleopatra later handles her own siblings, her own rivals, and her own path to the throne. But let's get back to Berenice's story, because what she's about to do is going to shock everyone, including her father. See, Ptolemy XII has made a critical error. He's underestimated his daughter. He sees her as just another court princess, someone to be married off to secure an alliance when the time comes. He has no idea that she's been systematically building a network of supporters who are just as frustrated with his rule as she is. The breaking point comes when Ptolemy makes a decision that enrages not just Berenice, but much of the Egyptian population. He agrees to help Rome put down a rebellion in Syria, which means sending Egyptian troops to fight and die for Roman interests. This isn't just politically unpopular, it's seen as a betrayal of Egyptian sovereignty. Berenice knows this is her moment. The people are angry, the nobles are restless, and her father has never been weaker. But she also knows that timing is everything. Move too early, and she'll be crushed. Move too late, and the opportunity will pass. She has to strike at exactly the right moment with exactly the right amount of force. What happens next is like something out of a political thriller. Berenice doesn't announce her intentions or send ultimatums. Instead, she moves with the kind of calculated precision that would make Machiavelli proud. She begins by securing the loyalty of key military commanders, promising them wealth and status in her new regime. She reaches out to powerful merchants who control Egypt's trade networks, assuring them that she'll protect their interests better than her father ever could. Most importantly, she gains the support of the Alexandrian mob. In ancient Egypt, the people of Alexandria weren't just passive subjects. They were a political force in their own right, capable of making or breaking rulers through riots, demonstrations, and general civil unrest. Berenice understands that whoever controls Alexandria controls Egypt, and she's determined to win the city's support. Her strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. While her father focuses on pleasing distant Roman officials, Berenice focuses on the people right in front of her. She appears at public festivals. She makes generous donations to popular causes. She positions herself as the true defender of Egyptian traditions against foreign influence. And it works. By late 58 BCE, Berenice has built a coalition powerful enough to challenge the throne. But she knows that the actual coup will require perfect execution. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and she'll end up dead or exiled. The stakes couldn't be higher, because in the world of Ptolemaic politics, there are no second chances. The night she makes her move is probably one of the most tense moments in ancient Egyptian history. Imagine the palace in darkness, with only torches flickering in the corridors. Berenice's supporters are positioned throughout the building, ready to strike. The loyal guards have either been bought off or replaced. Everything depends on speed and surprise. When dawn breaks over Alexandria, Egypt has a new ruler. Ptolemy XII has fled the city, probably in the middle of the night, abandoning his throne to save his life. And sitting in his place, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, is his daughter Berenice IV. The coup is complete, but the real challenge is just beginning. Because taking power is one thing, keeping it is something else entirely. Berenice now faces the same problems that drove her to rebellion in the first place, plus a few new ones created by her dramatic rise to power. The first thing Berenice realizes as she sits on the throne of Egypt is that everyone is watching her. waiting for her to make a mistake. The Roman Senate is furious that their puppet king has been overthrown. The Egyptian nobles who supported her are expecting immediate rewards for their loyalty. The people of Alexandria want proof that she's truly different from her father. And somewhere out there, Ptolemy XII is probably planning his comeback. But here's what makes Berenice absolutely fascinating as a ruler. She doesn't panic. She doesn't try to please everyone at once. Instead, she does something that shows just how brilliant her political mind really is. She immediately begins consolidating her power by addressing the one issue that had made her father so unpopular in the first place: Egypt's relationship with Rome. Now you have to understand the impossible position Egypt was in during this period. Rome wasn't yet the empire we think of today, but it was already the dominant military power in the Mediterranean. They had conquered Greece, they controlled much of Asia Minor, and they were increasingly treating Egypt like a client state rather than an independent kingdom. Egyptian pharaohs were expected to pay tribute, provide grain shipments, and basically do whatever Rome demanded. Berenice's genius move is to play a much more subtle game than her father ever did. Instead of openly defying Rome, which would invite immediate military intervention, she begins quietly strengthening Egypt's position. She increases trade with kingdoms that Rome doesn't control. She builds up the Egyptian navy. Most importantly, she starts forming alliances with other rulers who are just as concerned about Roman expansion as she is. Picture this. Berenice is holding court in the great throne room of Alexandria. The walls are covered in hieroglyphics, telling the stories of her ancestors' victories. Golden statues of Egyptian gods look down from their pedestals, and seated before her are ambassadors from across the known world, all eager to discuss potential partnerships with this new, unpredictable pharaoh. She's meeting with representatives from Parthia, Rome's greatest rival in the east. She's negotiating with Celtic tribes from Gaul, who are resisting Roman conquest. She's even reaching out to rebellious governors in Roman territories, who might be willing to switch sides if the price is right. What Berenice is doing is essentially building an anti-Roman coalition, but she's doing it so carefully that Rome doesn't realize what's happening until it's too late to stop easily. And while all this international intrigue is happening, she's also proving herself as a domestic ruler. Remember, Egypt wasn't just politically important, it was economically vital to the entire Mediterranean world. The Nile River made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. Egyptian grain fed Rome, Athens, and dozens of other major cities. Control Egypt's food supply, and you have leverage over everyone. Berenice understands this better than her father ever did. She begins implementing agricultural reforms that increase Egypt's grain production, while also ensuring that Egyptian farmers benefit from the increased wealth. She's not just growing more food to ship to Rome, she's growing more food to strengthen Egypt's position in international negotiations. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn, because Berenice faces a problem that no amount of political skill can solve. As a woman ruling alone, she's vulnerable in ways that male pharaohs never had to worry about. In the ancient world, unmarried female rulers were seen as temporary figures, placeholders waiting for the right man to come along and claim real power. Berenice knows she needs a husband, but not just any husband. She needs someone who will strengthen her position without threatening her authority. She needs a man with enough prestige to legitimize her rule in the eyes of foreign powers, but not so much ambition that he'll try to sideline her. And she needs to find this perfect partner, while also running a kingdom and fending off potential threats from her exiled father. The search for Berenice's husband becomes one of the most interesting royal marriage negotiations in ancient history. We're talking about a process that involves multiple kingdoms, enormous dowries, complex treaty negotiations, and enough palace intrigue to fill a dozen novels. Every potential suitor has to be evaluated, not just as a person, but as a political alliance. Her first choice is actually brilliant from a strategic standpoint. She decides to marry Seleucus Kaibiosactes, a member of the Seleucid royal family. Now, the Seleucids had once controlled a massive empire stretching from Turkey to India, but by Berenice's time, their kingdom had been reduced to just a small portion of Syria. However, they still had legitimate claims to territories that Rome wanted, which makes them perfect allies for someone trying to build an anti-Roman coalition. The wedding ceremony is probably spectacular. Imagine the great temple of Alexandria decorated with flowers from across the known world. Egyptian priests performing ancient rituals, while foreign diplomats look on. Berenice wearing the traditional pharaonic regalia, but also incorporating symbols from her new husband's Syrian heritage. The whole event is designed to send a message. Egypt is no longer isolated, no longer dependent on Rome's goodwill. But then something happens that shows just how ruthless Berenice can be when necessary. Within days of the wedding, maybe even on the wedding night itself, Seleucus is dead. And it's pretty clear that Berenice ordered his execution. Now, why would she kill her own husband immediately after marrying him? The answer reveals something crucial about Berenice's character and her approach to power. It turns out that Seleucus had been secretly negotiating with Roman officials, possibly planning to use his marriage to Berenice as a way to deliver Egypt back into Roman control. When Berenice discovers this betrayal, she doesn't hesitate. She eliminates the threat immediately and decisively. This moment is absolutely pivotal, not just for Berenice's story, but for understanding how the Ptolemaic family operated. Young Cleopatra, still watching and learning from her sister's example, sees that in their world, personal relationships are always secondary to political survival. Love, marriage, even family bonds can be sacrificed if they threaten the dynasty's power. Berenice's execution of Seleucus sends shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Roman officials realize they're dealing with someone far more dangerous than they initially thought. Foreign kings understand that Berenice isn't someone who can be manipulated or controlled. Even her own supporters see that their new pharaoh is willing to do whatever it takes to maintain Egypt's independence. But killing Seleucus also creates new problems. Berenice is once again a single ruler, which makes her politically vulnerable. She needs to find another husband, but now every potential suitor knows that marrying the pharaoh of Egypt might be a death sentence if you cross her. The pool of willing candidates has suddenly become much smaller. Her solution to this problem shows just how resourceful she can be. Instead of looking for another foreign prince who might have his own agenda, Berenice decides to marry Archelaus, a man with a fascinating background. He's technically a member of the Ptolemaic family, which gives him some legitimacy, but he's been living as a private citizen, which means he doesn't have independent power base that might threaten her authority. More importantly, Archelaus has spent years building relationships with various anti-Roman factions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. He brings to the marriage exactly what Berenice needs: connections with potential allies, but no independent agenda that conflicts with her own goals. Their partnership seems to work perfectly. Together, they continue building the coalition that Berenice started as a single ruler. They're coordinating with Parthian forces in the east, supporting rebellions against Roman rule in various provinces, and generally making themselves into exactly the kind of threat that Rome can't ignore much longer. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Ptolemy XII is desperately trying to convince the Roman Senate to restore him to power. He's promising increased tribute payments, better trade agreements, whatever it takes to get Roman military support for his return. But the Romans are hesitant to get involved in what looks like it could become a very expensive and complicated military campaign. And here's the thing though. Berenice's success is actually making Ptolemy more appealing to the Romans, not less. As long as Egypt had a weak, compliant ruler, Rome could afford to mostly ignore Egyptian politics. But now that Egypt has a strong, independent pharaoh who's actively working against Roman interests, Suddenly restoring the weak ruler starts looking like a much higher priority. The irony is perfect. By proving herself to be an effective leader, Berenice is actually creating the conditions that will eventually lead to her downfall. Every success she achieves, every alliance she builds, every sign of Egyptian strength under her rule, just makes the Romans more determined to replace her with someone they can control. And Ptolemy XII isn't just sitting around waiting for Roman help. He's actively working to undermine his daughter's regime from exile. He's bribing Egyptian officials to switch sides. He's spreading rumors about Berenice's legitimacy. He's even trying to turn her own supporters against her by offering them better deals than whatever they're getting from her. But the most dangerous thing Ptolemy does is something that Berenice probably never sees coming. He begins reaching out to his other children, the ones who stayed in Egypt when he fled. And that includes young Cleopatra, who's been watching this entire power struggle unfold and learning lessons that will shape her own approach to ruling Egypt. The situation becomes even more complex when we realize that Cleopatra, at this point, is around 12 years old. But she's not just any 12-year-old. She's a Ptolemaic princess who's been raised in the most sophisticated political environment in the ancient world. She understands that her father's exile isn't just a family drama. It's a fight for the future of Egypt itself. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Berenice knows that her younger siblings represent potential threats to her rule, but she also knows that eliminating them would be seen as going too far, even by Ptolemaic standards. Instead, she makes a calculated decision that shows just how politically savvy she really is. She keeps them close, but she also starts involving them in her administration. Think about what this means for young Cleopatra. She's essentially getting a masterclass in royal governance from someone who's seized power through pure political skill. Berenice doesn't just let her sit in on council meetings. She actively seeks her input on certain decisions. She's teaching Cleopatra how to read the political currents, how to identify potential allies and enemies, how to project strength even when you're feeling uncertain. But Berenice is also doing something else that's absolutely crucial. She's showing Cleopatra that it's possible for a woman to rule Egypt successfully without being dependent on male relatives or foreign powers. Every day that Berenice remains on the throne is proof that the Ptolemaic women are just as capable of leadership as the men. However, there's a problem that Berenice can't solve through political maneuvering or military strategy. Time is running out. By 55 BCE, Roman patience with the Egyptian situation is wearing thin. The grain shipments that Rome depends on are becoming irregular as Berenice redirects more of Egypt's resources toward building up her own military and supporting her anti-Roman allies. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's most powerful leaders, is starting to view the Egyptian situation as a personal opportunity. He sees that whoever successfully restores Ptolemy XII will earn not just the gratitude of a pharaoh, but also control over Egypt's incredible wealth. And Crassus is exactly the kind of Roman leader who's willing to use military force to get what he wants. At the same time, Berenice is facing challenges from within Egypt that she didn't anticipate. Some of the nobles who supported her coup are becoming impatient with her anti-Roman policies. They're worried that her confrontational approach is going to bring Roman legions marching into Egypt, which would be disastrous for everyone involved. Picture this scene. It's late at night in the palace, and Berenice is meeting with her most trusted advisors. The room is lit by oil lamps, and you can hear the distant sounds of Alexandria's nightlife through the windows. But the atmosphere in the room is tense, because they're discussing intelligence reports that suggest Ptolemy XII has finally secured Roman backing for his return. Her military commander is explaining that Roman forces are already gathering in Syria, just a few days' march from Egypt's borders. Her treasurer is reporting that several major Egyptian cities are showing signs of wavering loyalty, probably because local officials are hedging their bets in case Ptolemy returns. And her spy master is delivering the most disturbing news of all. There are rumors of a plot within the palace itself, possibly involving some of Berenice's own relatives. But here's what makes Berenice truly remarkable. Instead of panicking or trying to flee, she doubles down. She knows that her only chance of survival is to make her position so strong that even the Romans will think twice about attacking her directly. So she begins implementing what might be the most audacious strategy in ancient Egyptian history. First, she dramatically increases Egypt's military spending. She's not just buying more weapons and hiring more soldiers, she's investing in new military technologies. Egyptian engineers start working on improved siege engines, better naval vessels, more effective fortifications around key cities. She's essentially trying to modernize Egypt's military capabilities in a matter of months. Second, she accelerates her diplomatic outreach to anti-Roman forces throughout the Mediterranean. She sends envoys to Gallic tribes who are fighting Julius Caesar in the north. She offers military support to Parthian forces who are planning attacks on Roman territories in the east. She even reaches out to pirates and rebels who might be willing to disrupt Roman supply lines. Most importantly, she begins what can only be described as a propaganda war. Berenice understands that the battle for Egypt isn't just going to be fought with swords and spears. It's going to be fought for the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people. So she launches a campaign to present herself not just as a legitimate pharaoh, but as the defender of Egyptian independence against foreign domination. The propaganda is sophisticated and multifaceted. She commissions artists to create paintings and sculptures that show her in traditional pharaonic poses, but also emphasize her connection to the great queens of Egypt's past. She sponsors religious festivals that celebrate Egyptian gods and goddesses, subtly contrasting Egyptian spirituality with Roman materialism. She even starts appearing in public wearing traditional Egyptian clothing, rather than the Greek-influenced fashions that had become popular among the Ptolemaic elite. And it works. By early 55 BCE, Berenice has managed to generate genuine popular enthusiasm for her rule. The streets of Alexandria are filled with people chanting her name. Egyptian temples are offering prayers for her continued success. Even in the countryside, farmers and craftsmen are expressing support for the pharaoh who promises to protect Egypt from Roman exploitation. But while Berenice is building popular support, Ptolemy XII is making his final preparations for return. And he's not coming back alone. The Romans have agreed to provide him with military support, but they're also sending along a very clear message about what they expect in return. Egypt will become even more subordinate to Roman interests than it was before Berenice's coup. The force that Ptolemy assembles is impressive and terrifying. Roman legions form the core of his army, but he's also recruited mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. There are Germanic warriors who fight with massive two-handed swords. There are Gallic cavalry units known for their fearless charges. There are even some Numidian archers whose accuracy with their bows is legendary. More importantly, Ptolemy has secured the services of Aulus Gabinius, the Roman governor of Syria, who's bringing not just military expertise, but also siege equipment that Egypt has never seen before. We're talking about massive catapults that can hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, battering rams that can break through the strongest gates, and towers that allow attackers to fight from above city walls. When news of this approaching army reaches Alexandria, even Berenice's most loyal supporters start to waver. The odds against them are becoming almost impossible to ignore. They're not just facing Ptolemy's return, they're facing the full might of Roman military power. And everyone knows what happens to cities that resist Rome too stubbornly. But here's where we see Berenice's true character. Faced with overwhelming odds, she doesn't consider surrender or negotiation. Instead, she makes a decision that will echo through history and directly influence how her sister Cleopatra approaches similar challenges decades later. She decides to fight. Her reasoning is both practical and philosophical. Practically, she knows that surrendering to her father means certain death, not just for herself, but probably for her husband Archelaus and many of her supporters. Philosophically, she believes that Egypt's independence is worth fighting for, even if the chances of success are slim. So Berenice begins preparing Alexandria for siege. She orders the city's walls to be reinforced and expanded. She has weapons distributed to civilian volunteers who want to help defend their city. She moves Egypt's treasury and royal regalia to secure locations where they can't be captured easily. Most importantly, she starts planning for a defense strategy that will make taking Alexandria as costly as possible for the attacking forces. The preparations are massive and involve the entire population of the city. Imagine thousands of people working day and night to prepare for war. Blacksmiths are forging weapons and armor around the clock. Carpenters are building defensive structures and siege engines. Women and children are stockpiling food and medical supplies. Even the city's famous scholars and philosophers are contributing, using their knowledge to design better fortifications and more effective weapons. But Berenice isn't just preparing for a defensive battle. She's also planning offensive operations that might disrupt Ptolemy's advance before he can reach Alexandria. She sends her best cavalry units to harass the enemy's supply lines. She orders naval forces to attack any ships bringing reinforcements or supplies to her father's army. She even authorizes what we might today call guerrilla warfare tactics, with small Egyptian units striking at the enemy and then disappearing into the desert. The psychological warfare is just as intense as the military preparations. Berenice's agents spread stories about the terrible fate that awaits anyone who supports Ptolemy's return. They emphasize that the Romans see Egypt as nothing more than a source of wealth to be exploited, and that restoring Ptolemy means the end of Egyptian independence forever. They also circulate tales about Berenice's supernatural protection by Egyptian gods, suggesting that attacking her is not just politically unwise, but spiritually dangerous. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the atmosphere is electric with tension and determination. Berenice is holding daily council meetings with her military commanders, her diplomatic advisors, and her intelligence chiefs. Every decision has life or death consequences, and everyone knows that they're making history with every choice they make. Young Cleopatra is still there, still watching, still learning. But now she's not just observing political maneuvering, she's seeing how a pharaoh prepares for war. She's learning about military strategy, about the psychology of leadership under pressure, about how to inspire loyalty when everything seems hopeless. These lessons will prove invaluable when she faces her own military challenges later in life. But perhaps most importantly, Cleopatra is seeing how Berenice handles the possibility of defeat. Her older sister isn't just fighting for power or personal survival. She's fighting for an idea. She's fighting for the principle that Egypt should be ruled by Egyptians, not by Roman puppets. She's fighting for the belief that the Ptolemaic dynasty has a responsibility to protect Egyptian independence, even at the cost of their own lives. This philosophical approach to leadership will become one of Cleopatra's most distinctive characteristics. When she later faces Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she won't just be negotiating as someone who wants to keep her throne. She'll be negotiating as someone who believes that Egypt's greatness depends on maintaining its unique identity and independence, even within the Roman sphere of influence. As Ptolemy's army gets closer to Alexandria, the reports become more detailed and more frightening. The scouts describe a force that's not just large, but incredibly well organized and well equipped. These aren't just soldiers, they're professional warriors who've conquered cities across the Mediterranean. They know how to conduct sieges, how to break enemy morale, how to turn civilian populations against their own rulers. But the most disturbing intelligence concerns Ptolemy himself. The man who fled Alexandria in the middle of the night 3 years earlier is not the same person who's now approaching with a Roman army. Exile has hardened him, made him more ruthless and more determined. He's no longer the weak flute player that his daughter overthrew. He's become someone willing to destroy parts of Egypt in order to reclaim his throne. The reports suggest that Ptolemy has already made deals with various Egyptian cities, promising rewards to those who submit immediately and threatening terrible punishment for those who resist. He's not just planning to restore the old order, he's planning to create a new system where Egyptian independence is permanently subordinated to Roman interests. Berenice knows that this is her final test. Everything she's accomplished over the past 3 years, every alliance she's built, every reform she's implemented, every moment of Egyptian pride she's restored, it all comes down to the next few weeks. Either she'll prove that Egypt can defend itself against foreign domination, or she'll become a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying Rome. The first skirmishes begin while Ptolemy's main force is still days away from Alexandria. Berenice's cavalry units clash with advanced Roman scouts in the desert outside the city. The fighting is fierce but inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory while actually learning about their enemy's capabilities and tactics. What becomes clear from these early encounters is that this isn't going to be a quick or easy campaign for either side. Berenice's forces are fighting with the desperation of people defending their homeland, while Ptolemy's army has the confidence and experience of professional soldiers who've never known defeat. The collision between these two forces is going to be spectacular and devastating, but there's another factor that nobody fully anticipated. The Egyptian people themselves are becoming active participants in this conflict in ways that go beyond simple military service. Farmers are destroying their own crops rather than let them fall into Roman hands. Merchants are hiding their goods or smuggling them out of areas that might be occupied. Even priests are taking sides, with some temples offering sanctuary to Berenice's supporters, while others prepare to welcome Ptolemy's return. This popular involvement transforms what might have been a simple dynastic struggle into something much larger and more significant. It becomes a war about Egyptian identity, about the relationship between Egypt and Rome, about the future direction of one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. And at the center of it all is Berenice, no longer just a rebellious princess or an ambitious usurper, but a symbol of Egyptian resistance to foreign domination. Whether she wins or loses, whether she lives or dies, her 3-year reign has already changed Egypt forever. She's proven that the Ptolemaic women can rule as effectively as the men. She's demonstrated that Egypt can stand up to Roman pressure. And she's shown that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for personal gain, but for principles and ideals. The stage is set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in ancient history. A battle that will determine not just who rules Egypt, but what kind of country Egypt will become. And watching it all, learning from every moment, is young Cleopatra, absorbing lessons that will shape her own legendary career as the last pharaoh of Egypt. But as winter turns to spring in 55 BCE, something unexpected happens that changes everything. Just when it seems like the final confrontation is inevitable, Berenice receives intelligence that makes her blood run cold. Her spies report that Ptolemy isn't just bringing Roman soldiers to Egypt. He's bringing something far worse. A detailed list of everyone who supported her coup, everyone who helped her stay in power, everyone who ever showed her the slightest loyalty. The message is clear. This isn't going to be a traditional restoration where the losing side faces exile or imprisonment. Ptolemy is planning what we would today call a purge. He intends to systematically eliminate not just Berenice herself, but hundreds, possibly thousands of Egyptians who dared to support her vision of an independent Egypt. Picture the moment when Berenice learns this news. She's standing in her private chambers, overlooking the harbor of Alexandria. The room is filled with maps showing the positions of various military units, scrolls containing diplomatic correspondence, and reports from spies throughout the Mediterranean. But now, spread across her desk, is a document that changes everything. A copy of her father's death list. Reading through the names, Berenice sees people who trusted her, who believed in her cause, who sacrificed their own safety to support Egyptian independence. There are military commanders who chose her over her father. There are merchants who provided financial backing for her regime. There are scholars and priests who legitimized her rule through their public support. and now all of these people are going to die because they believed in her. This is the moment that transforms Berenice from a political leader into something else entirely. She's no longer just fighting for her own survival or even for her right to rule Egypt. She's fighting for the lives of everyone who ever showed her loyalty. The personal stakes have become unbearable, but they've also clarified her purpose in a way that makes her more dangerous than ever before. Her response to this discovery reveals something crucial about her character. Instead of trying to negotiate some kind of deal that might save her own life, instead of abandoning her supporters to save herself, Berenice makes a decision that will echo through the rest of Egyptian history. She decides that if Ptolemy wants to destroy everyone who supported Egyptian independence, then he's going to have to pay the highest possible price for that destruction. What she does next is absolutely brilliant from a military standpoint, but also heartbreaking from a human perspective. Berenice begins implementing a strategy that essentially turns all of Egypt into a battlefield. She's not just going to defend Alexandria and hope for the best. She's going to make every mile of Egyptian territory that Ptolemy wants to reclaim cost him dearly in blood and resources. Her orders go out to military commanders throughout Egypt, and they're unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen from a Ptolemaic ruler. She's authorizing a total war approach that puts Egyptian independence above everything else, including the preservation of Egypt's cities, monuments, and even population centers. The plan is devastatingly simple. As Ptolemy's forces advance into Egypt, they'll find nothing useful waiting for them. Wells will be poisoned or filled with sand. Granaries will be emptied or burned. Roads will be destroyed to slow their advance. Bridges will be collapsed to force them into vulnerable river crossings. Every resource that might help the invading army will be eliminated before they can use it. But Berenice goes even further than that. She begins relocating Egypt's portable wealth to secure locations where Ptolemy can't easily access it. The royal treasury is divided into dozens of smaller caches hidden throughout Egypt. Precious artifacts from temples are moved to remote desert locations to prevent them from being captured. Even the palace's collection of rare books and scrolls is dispersed. Most importantly, she starts evacuating the civilian population from areas that are likely to see heavy fighting. This isn't just about protecting innocent people, although that's certainly part of her motivation. It's also about denying Ptolemy the legitimacy that comes from ruling over actual subjects. If he wants to be pharaoh of Egypt, he's going to have to rule over empty cities and abandoned villages. The logistics of this operation are staggering. We're talking about moving hundreds of thousands of people, along with their livestock, their belongings, and their most precious possessions. Entire communities are packing up everything they own and traveling to designated safe areas, usually in southern Egypt, where Berenice's control is strongest. Picture the roads leading south from Alexandria during these weeks. They're crowded with families carrying everything they can manage, driving herds of cattle and goats, loading donkeys and camels with household goods. Children are crying because they don't understand why they have to leave their homes. Elderly people are struggling to keep up with the pace of the evacuation, but everyone is moving with a sense of purpose because they believe they're participating in something larger than themselves. At the same time, Berenice is conducting what might be the most sophisticated intelligence operation in ancient Egyptian history. She's not just gathering information about Ptolemy's military plans. She's actively working to disrupt his operations through espionage, sabotage, and psychological warfare. Her agents are infiltrating Ptolemy's army, spreading rumors designed to undermine morale and create suspicion between Roman and Egyptian units. They're bribing supply contractors to deliver defective equipment or contaminated food. They're even conducting targeted assassinations against key officers who might be particularly effective at organizing the invasion. The psychological warfare is particularly sophisticated. Berenice's propagandists are circulating stories throughout Egypt about the terrible things that happened to other countries that submitted to Roman rule. They're describing how Roman governors tax their subjects into poverty, how Roman soldiers abuse local populations, how Roman merchants destroy traditional ways of life. but they're also spreading more subtle messages designed to appeal to Egyptian pride and religious beliefs. They're reminding people of the great pharaohs of Egypt's past, rulers who built the pyramids and conquered vast territories and made Egypt the envy of the ancient world. They're asking whether Egyptians really want to become subjects of foreign masters, whether the land of the pharaohs should bow down to Roman politicians. The religious dimension of this propaganda campaign is particularly important because it taps into something that goes deeper than politics or economics. For thousands of years, Egyptians have believed that their pharaoh is not just a political ruler but a divine figure, someone chosen by the gods to protect Egypt and its people. By positioning herself as the defender of Egyptian religious traditions against foreign influence, Berenice is claiming a legitimacy that goes beyond military power or political maneuvering, and it's working. Throughout Egypt, people are responding to Berenice's call with an enthusiasm that surprises even her own supporters. Temples are holding special ceremonies praying for her success. Farmers are volunteering to serve in her army even though it means abandoning their crops. Craftsmen are working without payment to produce weapons and equipment for the war effort. But perhaps most importantly, the evacuation is creating a sense of shared sacrifice that unites Egyptians across social and economic lines. Rich merchants and poor farmers are facing the same hardships, making the same sacrifices, sharing the same hopes and fears. The traditional divisions that have always characterized Egyptian society are breaking down as people focus on their common identity as Egyptians resisting foreign domination. Meanwhile, Ptolemy's advance into Egypt is proving more difficult than anyone anticipated. His Roman advisors had expected to march triumphantly through welcoming cities, accepting the surrender of Egyptian officials who were eager to be on the winning side. Instead, they're encountering a landscape that seems designed to frustrate and exhaust them. Every day brings new challenges that slow their progress and drain their resources. Water sources that their maps show as reliable turn out to be poisoned or dry. Roads that should be easy to travel have been rendered impassable by carefully placed obstacles. Local guides who claim to know the best routes through the desert lead them into dead ends or ambushes. The Roman soldiers, who are used to conquering enemies through straightforward military campaigns, find themselves fighting a war unlike anything they've experienced before. There are no pitched battles where their superior training and equipment can decide the outcome quickly. Instead, there's constant harassment by small Egyptian units that attack and then disappear into terrain they know better than any foreign invader ever could. The psychological impact on Ptolemy's forces is severe. These are professional soldiers who pride themselves on their efficiency and their ability to impose Roman order on chaotic foreign territories. But Egypt, under Berenice's leadership, isn't behaving like other countries they've conquered. It's not collapsing into internal divisions that Romans can exploit. It's not producing local collaborators eager to betray their own people for Roman gold. Instead, Egypt is presenting a unified front of resistance that makes every mile of advance feel like a victory that's been bought at too high a price. Roman, who seem to know exactly when and where they'll be most vulnerable, are getting sick from contaminated water. Supply convoys are being attacked by fighters' equipment is breaking down because of sand, heat, and the constant stress of operating casualties are mounting, not from major battles but from constant attrition. Soldiers in hostile territory. But the most demoralizing aspect of the campaign for Ptolemy's forces is the realization that they're not liberating Egyptian cities from a tyrannical usurper. They're conquering a country whose people genuinely support their current ruler. When Roman soldiers finally reach Egyptian towns and villages, they don't find populations celebrating their arrival. They find empty buildings, abandoned streets, and an eerie silence that suggests the people chose to leave rather than welcome Ptolemy's return. For Ptolemy himself, this resistance represents something more than a military challenge. It's a personal rejection that cuts deeper than any political setback he's ever experienced. These are his own people, subjects he ruled for years before his daughter's coup, and they're choosing her over him. They're choosing the uncertainty of war over the security of submission to his Roman-backed restoration. The emotional impact of this rejection begins to affect Ptolemy's decision-making in ways that his Roman advisors find increasingly problematic. Instead of focusing on efficient military objectives, he starts making choices based on anger and wounded pride. He orders harsh reprisals against captured Egyptian soldiers. He authorizes the destruction of monuments and temples associated with Berenice's reign. He even begins executing Egyptian prisoners as a way of sending a message about the price of continued resistance. These brutal tactics backfire spectacularly. Instead of intimidating Egyptians into submission, they reinforce Berenice's message that Roman rule means the end of Egyptian civilization as they know it. Every atrocity committed by Ptolemy's forces becomes a recruiting tool for Berenice's cause, proof that she was right to resist her father's return. The Roman commanders start to realize that they've gotten involved in something far more complex than a simple dynastic dispute. What they thought would be a quick restoration of a client king is turning into a grinding war of attrition that could drag on for years. The costs are mounting, both in terms of military casualties and financial resources, while the benefits of controlling Egypt are becoming increasingly uncertain. Some of the Roman officers begin privately questioning whether Ptolemy is worth the investment they're making in his restoration. A pharaoh who needs foreign armies to control his own people is going to be weak and unreliable even if he does regain his throne. And a pharaoh who rules over a devastated and resentful population won't be able to provide the economic benefits that made Egypt attractive to Rome in the first place. But by this point, Roman pride is involved in a way that makes withdrawal politically impossible. They've committed significant military resources to Ptolemy's campaign, and abandoning him now would send a message throughout the Mediterranean that Rome can be defeated by determined local resistance. Other client kings might start getting ideas about independence. Other subject peoples might begin to wonder whether Roman power is as overwhelming as it appears. So the campaign continues, becoming increasingly brutal and destructive as both sides realize that compromise is no longer possible. Ptolemy can't afford to negotiate with Berenice because that would legitimize her rebellion and encourage future challenges to his authority. Berenice can't afford to surrender because she knows that would mean death, not just for herself, but for everyone who supported her. As spring progresses into summer, the war reaches Egyptian territories that are closer to Alexandria, areas where Berenice's support is strongest and most organized. The fighting becomes more intense as both sides commit their best troops and resources to battles that everyone understands will determine the outcome of the entire conflict. But something else is happening that neither side fully anticipated. The war is creating its own momentum, generating hatreds and loyalties that go beyond the original political dispute between Berenice and her father. Egyptian soldiers who've watched their comrades die fighting Roman legions develop a permanent hostility toward foreign rule that will outlast this particular conflict. Roman soldiers who've lost friends to Egyptian ambushes and guerrilla attacks develop a contempt for Egyptian independence that will influence Roman policy for generations. Young Cleopatra, still in Alexandria, but now directly exposed to the realities of war, is absorbing lessons about power that go far beyond anything she learned during the peaceful years of Berenice's reign. She's seeing how political disputes can escalate into total warfare, how foreign intervention can transform domestic conflicts, how the decisions made by rulers affect the lives of ordinary people in ways that can't be undone. But she's also seeing something that will prove crucial for her own future career. She's learning that Egypt's relationship with Rome isn't just a matter of diplomatic negotiation or economic exchange. It's fundamentally a question of power, and power in the ancient world ultimately comes from the ability to use force effectively. All the cultural sophistication, all the economic wealth, all the diplomatic skill in the world won't protect Egypt if its rulers can't defend it militarily. This realization will shape every major decision Cleopatra makes as pharaoh. When she later allies herself with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she's not just seeking powerful protectors. She's trying to solve the fundamental problem that Berenice faced: how to maintain Egyptian independence in a world dominated by Roman military power. As the summer of 55 BCE progresses, both armies converge on the approaches to Alexandria, setting the stage for the climactic battles that will determine not just who rules Egypt, but what kind of country Egypt will become. The city that has been the center of learning and culture for the ancient world is about to become a battlefield where the future of one of history's greatest civilizations will be decided. The preparations inside Alexandria are unlike anything the city has ever seen. Every street corner has been fortified. Every building has been prepared for use as a defensive position. The famous lighthouse that guides ships into the harbor has been equipped with military signaling equipment. Even the grate into a command center for core library, the repository of human knowledge, has been turned, innating the city's defense. But the most remarkable aspect of Alexandria's preparation is the enthusiasm of its civilian population. These aren't just subjects obeying orders from their ruler. These are people who believe they're fighting for something worth dying for. They're fighting for the idea that Egypt should be ruled by Egyptians, that the land of the pharaohs shouldn't become just another Roman province, that their children should inherit a country that's still recognizably Egyptian. The atmosphere in the city is electric with tension, determination, and something that can only be described as patriotic fervor. In the markets, vendors are selling food to soldiers at cost or giving it away entirely. In the workshops, craftsmen are producing weapons and armor around the clock. In the temples, priests are conducting ceremonies asking the gods to protect Egypt and its people. And in the palace, Berenice is making her final preparations for what she knows will be the defining moment of her life. She's not just preparing to defend a city or even a throne. She's preparing to defend an idea, a vision of what Egypt can be if it remains true to itself and refuses to surrender its independence to foreign masters. The battle for Alexandria is about to begin, and with it, the final chapter of Berenice's extraordinary story. But win or lose, live or die, she's already changed Egypt forever. She's proven that the Ptolemaic dynasty can produce rulers who put Egyptian interests above personal survival. She's demonstrated that Egypt can resist even Roman pressure if its people are united behind a leader they believe in. Most importantly, she's provided young Cleopatra with a template for how to rule Egypt with dignity, courage, and an uncompromising commitment to Egyptian greatness. Every lesson Cleopatra learned from watching Berenice will influence her own legendary career as the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who would captivate Julius Caesar and Mark Antony while fighting her own battles to preserve Egyptian independence in an increasingly Roman world. The stage is set for the most dramatic siege in Egyptian history, a confrontation that will echo through the centuries and inspire future generations of leaders who refuse to surrender their principles, even when faced with overwhelming odds. The siege of Alexandria begins not with the clash of armies, but with something far more terrifying: silence. For 3 days, Ptolemy's forces simply surround the city, setting up their camps just beyond arrow range, letting the psychological pressure build. Roman engineers work methodically, constructing the massive siege engines that will soon rain destruction on Egypt's greatest city. But it's the waiting, the knowing that death is coming, but not knowing exactly when, that tests the nerves of even Alexandria's most determined defenders. Berenice uses these 3 days brilliantly. While her enemies prepare their war machines, she's conducting what might be the most sophisticated psychological operation in ancient military history. Every night, small groups of Egyptian soldiers slip out of the city under cover of darkness. They're not launching attacks, they're delivering messages, personal messages to individual soldiers in Ptolemy's army. reminding them that they're Egyptians fighting against other Egyptians, that they're helping foreigners conquer their own homeland. Picture this. A Roman centurion is making his rounds through the camp when he discovers one of his Egyptian auxiliary soldiers reading a papyrus scroll by torchlight. The message is simple, but devastating. It's from the soldier's brother, who's fighting with Berenice inside Alexandria. The letter describes the man's children, mentions his wife by name, talks about the farm they grew up on together. Then it asks a single question that cuts to the heart of everything. When the Romans are finished using us to conquer our own country, what do you think they'll do with us then? These messages are working. Desertion rates among Egyptian units in Ptolemy's army start climbing dramatically. But more importantly, the remaining Egyptian soldiers become unreliable in ways that Roman commanders find increasingly problematic. They're slow to follow orders, quick to retreat from officers, start to realize they have a serious problem. They in the brutal tactics that siege warfare demands. The Roman dangerous positions, reluctant to participate, came to Egypt expecting to fight Berenice's army, but they're discovering that they're actually fighting the Egyptian people themselves. And fighting infinitely more difficult than fighting an army that can be defeated in a population that doesn't want to be conquered is a decisive battle. But Ptolemy himself is past the point of rational calculation. The 3 years of exile, the humiliation of depending on foreign armies, the rejection by his own people, it's all combined to create something approaching madness. When his Roman advisors suggest that would allow both sides to save face, his that he might want to negotiate some kind of settlement suggestions. He's not interested in becoming responses so violent that they stop making such pharaoh again. He wants to prove that challenging his authority brings consequences so terrible that no one will ever dare to repeat Berenice's rebellion. He's planning to make an example of Alexandria that will be remembered for centuries, a demonstration of what happens to cities that resist Roman power. The siege engines are finally ready on the 4th day, and the bombardment begins at dawn. The sound is unlike anything Alexandria has ever heard. Massive stones hurled by catapults crash into buildings with impacts that can be felt throughout the city. The walls shake under the assault of battering rams operated by dozens of soldiers working in coordinated rhythm. Giant crossbows fire bolts the size of spears that can pierce through multiple defenders with a single shot. But Alexandria doesn't break easily. The city's defenses have been prepared with the kind of desperate ingenuity that only comes from knowing you're fighting for survival. Every stone thrown by Roman catapults is immediately collected by teams of Egyptian workers, who carry it to their own defensive positions. Buildings that are damaged by the bombardment are quickly converted into improvised fortresses that are actually harder to attack than the original structures. Most impressively, the Alexandrians have turned their famous intellectual culture into a military asset. The scholars and philosophers who normally spend their time debating abstract questions are now applying their analytical skills to practical problems of warfare. They're calculating the optimal angles for defensive catapults, designing new types of fortifications based on mathematical principles, even developing improved medical techniques for treating wounded soldiers. The Great Library itself becomes a center for military innovation. Texts on engineering, mathematics, and natural philosophy that were written centuries earlier are suddenly being used to solve immediate tactical problems. Ancient Greek treatises on siege warfare are being consulted alongside Egyptian records of successful defensive campaigns. The accumulated knowledge of centuries is being mobilized in service of Alexandria. Cleopatra finds herself in effort, not just as an observer, but as an active participant. Her, the middle of this intellectual war's survival. Young teach her about literature and philosophy are now involving tutors, the same scholars who normally her in discussions about military strategy and resource management. She's learning about logistics, about the psychology of leadership under pressure, about the practical challenges of maintaining civilian morale during a siege. But she's also learning something more subtle and more important. she's discovering that leadership isn't just about giving orders or making speeches. Real leadership, the kind that inspires people to risk their lives for a cause, comes from sharing the same dangers and hardships as the people you're asking this instinctively, instead, to follow you. Berenice understood the importance of staying safely in the palace while her soldiers fought and died on the walls. She was constantly moving throughout the city, appearing wherever the fighting is fiercest, sharing meals with common soldiers, personally tending to wounded defenders. She's not just the Queen of Egypt, she's become the living symbol of Egyptian resistance. Her presence on the front lines has an electric effect on Alexandria's defenders. Soldiers who might otherwise retreat in the face of overwhelming Roman attacks find themselves fighting with supernatural them, facing the same dangers they are. Citizens who might be tempted to seek courage when they see their pharaoh standing beside it volunteer for the most dangerous assignments because they want safety by fleeing the city, instead to prove themselves worthy of a ruler who's willing to die for Egypt. The psychological impact extends beyond Alexandria's walls. Reports of Berenice's courage spread throughout Ptolemy's army, creating exactly the kind of comparison that he least wants his soldiers to make. Here's a woman who's willing to risk everything for her principles, while their own king hides behind foreign bodyguards and lets Roman officers make the crucial decisions. The contrast is devastating for whatever remains of Ptolemy's legitimacy among Egyptian troops. As the siege progresses into its second week, the nature of the fighting begins to change in ways that surprise both sides. Instead of the methodical, professional warfare that Roman legions are famous for, the battle for Alexandria becomes something more desperate and personal. Egyptian defenders aren't just following military orders, they're defending their homes, their families, their entire way of life. Roman soldiers aren't just conquering another city, they're trying to destroy a civilization that refuses to submit. The brutality escalates accordingly. Roman forces begin using tactics that they normally reserve for rebellious barbarian tribes, not for fellow Mediterranean civilizations. They're targeting civilian areas with their siege engines, trying to break the city's morale by making life unbearable for non-combatants. They're poisoning water sources that supply residential districts. They're even launching diseased corpses over the walls using catapults, hoping to start epidemics that will force Alexandria to surrender. Alexandria's response is equally ruthless. Egyptian defenders begin targeting Roman supply lines with a systematic thoroughness that goes beyond normal military harassment. They're not just attacking convoys carrying food and weapons, they're destroying the roads themselves, making it almost impossible for Ptolemy's army to maintain the logistical support that siege warfare requires. They're also conducting targeted assassinations of Roman officers, eliminating the experienced leaders who know how to coordinate complex military operations. But the most effective Egyptian tactic is something that demonstrates just how completely Berenice has transformed Alexandria into a unified community of resistance. The city begins producing its own supplies faster than the Romans can destroy them. Workshops that normally manufacture luxury goods for wealthy merchants are now producing weapons and armor. Bakeries that served the city's restaurants are now feeding the army. Even Alexandria's famous artists and entertainers contribute by creating propaganda that keeps civilian morale high despite the constant bombardment. The Romans find themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire society that's mobilized for war. Every civilian they encounter might be a spy, gathering intelligence about their movements. Every building they capture might be booby-trapped with devices designed to kill unwary occupiers. Every street they control during the day might be infiltrated by Egyptian fighters during the night. This kind of total warfare is exhausting for professional soldiers, who are used to clear distinctions between combatants and civilians, between military objectives and civilian infrastructure. Roman legions are trained to fight enemy armies and capture strategic positions, not to occupy hostile populations that refuse to accept defeat. The psychological stress begins to show in increased incidents of indiscipline, unauthorized violence against prisoners, and growing tensions between Roman officers and their Egyptian auxiliaries. The The siege reaches a turning point during its third week, when Berenice makes a decision that transforms the entire character of the conflict. Intelligence reports suggest that Ptolemy is planning a massive assault that will involve simultaneous attacks on multiple sections of Alexandria's walls. The Roman plan is to overwhelm the city's defenders by forcing them to spread their forces too thin to maintain effective resistance at any single point. Berenice's response to this intelligence is audacious beyond anything her enemies anticipated. Instead of trying to defend every part of Alexandria's perimeter, she decides to abandon the outer sections of the city entirely. She orders a controlled retreat that concentrates all of her forces in Alexandria's inner districts, around the palace, the library, and the harbour. But this isn't a desperate last stand by a defeated army. It's a calculated strategy designed to turn Alexandria's urban geography into a weapon against the invading forces. By withdrawing to the city centre, Berenice is forcing the Romans to fight in an environment where their numerical superiority and siege equipment become less effective. The narrow streets and dense building patterns of inner Alexandria favour defenders who know the terrain intimately over attackers who are unfamiliar with the city's layout. More importantly, the withdrawal allows Berenice to implement the final phase of her scorched earth strategy. As Egyptian forces pull back from the outer districts, they systematically destroy everything that might be useful to the occupying army. Wells are filled with rubble, granaries are burned, even the sewage systems are sabotaged to create health hazards for anyone trying to use the abandoned buildings. The Romans find themselves in possession of empty ruins rather than a conquered city. They control Alexandria's outer walls, but those walls now protect nothing worth having. They've captured districts full of buildings, but those buildings have been stripped of everything valuable and rendered uninhabitable. Most frustratingly, they're no closer to achieving their actual objective, which is forcing Berenice to surrender and restoring Ptolemy to undisputed control of Egypt. The urban warfare that follows is unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen. Roman soldiers advance through Alexandria's streets, only to find themselves trapped in carefully prepared killing zones, where Egyptian archers can attack from hidden positions in upper-story windows. Egyptian fighters use their knowledge of the city's underground passages and rooftop connections to appear and disappear like ghosts, striking at Roman patrols and then vanishing before reinforcements can arrive. The fighting becomes intensely personal in ways that traditional battlefield combat never achieves. Roman soldiers and Egyptian defenders recognize each other as individuals, learn each other's tactics and preferences, develop the kind of intimate hatred that only comes from prolonged close-quarters combat. Every street corner becomes a contested battlefield. Every building becomes a potential fortress. Every day brings new casualties from an enemy that seems to be everywhere and nowhere. An aspect of this urban warfare is how at the same time. But the most remarkable affects the civilian population. Instead of fleeing from the fighting or trying to stay neutral, Alexandria's non-combatants become active participants in the resistance. Merchants provide supplies to Egyptian fighters and refuse to sell anything to Roman soldiers. Women and children serve as messengers and spies, carrying information through parts of the city that Roman patrols can't safely enter. Even elderly people contribute by maintaining the hidden supply caches and safe houses that allow the resistance to continue functioning despite constant pressure from occupying forces. This level of popular participation in warfare is unprecedented in the ancient Mediterranean world. Most cities that face siege either surrender quickly to avoid destruction, or rely on their professional soldiers to conduct the defense while civilians wait passively for the Berenice's leadership outcome. Alexandria underrepresents something entirely new. An entire urban population that's chosen to fight rather than submit, regardless of the personal cost. The psychological impact on Roman forces is severe and cumulative. These are soldiers who joined the legions expecting to win glory through decisive victories over foreign enemies. Instead, they find themselves involved in a grinding urban conflict, where victory seems to require killing every single person in one of the ancient world's greatest cities. The moral weight of that realization begins to affect even the most hardened veterans. Letters that Roman soldiers send home during this period reveal the strain they're experiencing. They write about fighting an enemy that includes women and children, about occupying a city where every civilian might be a potential threat, about the difficulty of maintaining military discipline when the normal rules of warfare seem to have broken down entirely. Some letters express admiration for the courage of Alexandria's defenders, even while describing the frustration of fighting an enemy that refuses to accept defeat. But the most significant psychological factor is the growing realization among Roman troops that they're not liberating Egypt from a tyrant. They're destroying Egypt to restore a pharaoh that his own people reject. The propaganda value of Berenice's resistance is becoming impossible to ignore. Here's a woman who's chosen to die rather than submit to foreign domination, while the man they're fighting to restore owes his power entirely to foreign military supports. As the siege enters its fourth week, supply problems begin to affect both armies in ways that transform the strategic situation. Ptolemy's forces are discovering that maintaining a large army in a hostile territory is far more expensive and complicated than their Roman advisors had anticipated. The constant harassment of supply convoys means that food, water, and military equipment arrive irregularly and in smaller quantities than needed. Soldiers are going hungry, weapons are breaking down without adequate replacement parts, and medical supplies are running dangerously low. But Alexandria's situation is even more precarious. The city's normal sources of food and fresh water have been cut off by the siege, and the concentrated population in the inner districts is straining the available resources beyond their limits. Berenice's advisors begin presenting her with increasingly grim reports about how long the city can continue to hold out before starvation forces a surrender. Her response to these reports reveals something crucial about her character and her approach to leadership. Instead of looking for ways to negotiate a route that might allow her to continue favorable surrender or seeking escape the fight from elsewhere, Berenice decides to share the city's remaining resources as equally as possible among all of Alexandria's defenders, regardless of their social status or military rank. Picture this scene: the royal dining hall, where Ptolemaic pharaohs have feasted in luxury for 3 centuries, is now serving the same simple rations that are available to common soldiers and ordinary civilians. Berenice sits at the head table, not because she's eating better food than anyone else, but because she wants everyone to see that their queen is facing the same hardships they are. This gesture has an enormous impact on Alexandria's morale. In a world where social hierarchy is usually maintained even during the most desperate circumstances, Berenice's willingness to share her subjects' suffering demonstrates a kind of leadership that inspires genuine devotion rather than mere obedience. Soldiers who might otherwise consider desertion or surrender choose to stay and fight because they don't want to abandon a ruler who's proven herself worthy of their sacrifice. The psychological warfare continues, even as the military situation becomes increasingly desperate. Berenice's agents continue to infiltrate Ptolemy's camps, but now their messages focus on the contrast between her behavior and his. While she shares her soldiers' dangers and deprivations, he remains safely behind Roman lines, protected by foreign bodyguards, eating food that's been shipped from Rome while Egyptian troops go hungry. These comparisons are particularly effective because they tap into cultural values that go beyond immediate political loyalties. In Egyptian tradition, a true pharaoh is supposed to be the protector and provider for his people, someone who puts their welfare above his own comfort and safety. By highlighting the ways that Berenice embodies these traditional values while Ptolemy violates them, her propaganda creates cognitive dissonance even among soldiers who started the campaign, believing in the legitimacy of his restoration. The defections from Ptolemy's army become a flood rather than a trickle. Entire units of Egyptian auxiliaries begin switching sides, bringing with them detailed intelligence about Roman battle plans and tactical capabilities, but more importantly, They bring first-hand testimony about the demoralization that's spreading through the besieging army. Roman soldiers are starting to question whether conquering Alexandria is worth the cost they're being asked to pay. Some Roman officers begin sending private messages to their political contacts in Rome, suggesting that the Egyptian campaign is becoming a quagmire that might damage Rome's reputation more than enhance it. The reports describe an enemy that can't be defeated through conventional military means, a population that prefers destruction to submission, a conflict that's consuming resources without producing the expected benefits. But Roman pride and political commitments make withdrawal impossible. Too much prestige has been invested in Ptolemy's restoration for Rome to abandon the project without achieving has become a test decisive results. The campaign of Roman military capability and failure in Egypt might encourage other client kings to challenge Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean. As winter approaches, both armies face the prospect of continuing the siege through months of cold weather that will make an already difficult situation nearly unbearable. Roman forces will have to maintain their positions around Alexandria while dealing with supply problems that become worse as storms make sea travel more dangerous. Egyptian defenders will have to survive in a city that's already running short of food and fuel, with no prospect of relief from outside sources. The approaching winter also creates a deadline that changes the strategic calculations for both sides. If the siege continues much longer, it will become a war of attrition that favors whichever side can better endure prolonged suffering. Berenice believes that Alexandria's defenders, fighting for their homes and their independence, will outlast foreign invaders who are fighting for someone else's political ambitions. Ptolemy and his Roman advisors believe that a besieged city will eventually succumb to hunger and disease, regardless of its inhabitants' motivation. But there's another factor that neither side fully anticipated. The siege of Alexandria has become the most important news story in the Mediterranean world. Reports about the conflict are reaching every major city, every royal court, every political gathering from Spain to Syria. The story of a woman who's chosen to fight Rome rather than submit to a puppet king is capturing imaginations and inspiring conversations about power, legitimacy, and resistance. In Athens, philosophers debate whether Berenice's rebellion represents a legitimate defense of political independence or a dangerous example of lawlessness that threatens social order. In Gaul, tribal leaders who are fighting their own wars against Roman expansion see Alexandria's resistance as proof that Rome can be defeated by determined local opposition. Even in Rome itself, some senators begin questioning whether the Egyptian campaign represents sound policy or expensive adventurism that diverts resources from more important objectives. The international attention creates pressure on both sides to achieve a decisive resolution rather than allowing the conflict to drag on indefinitely. Berenice knows that prolonged resistance will enhance her reputation as a defender of independence, but only if she can avoid a defeat so complete that it discourages future rebellions against Roman power. Ptolemy knows that a quick victory will restore his credibility as the effective client king, but a protracted siege that ends in Pyrrhic victory might leave him ruling over ruins rather than a functioning kingdom. As autumn progresses toward winter, both armies begin preparing for what everyone understands will be the final phase of the siege. The Romans start concentrating their remaining resources for one massive assault, designed to overwhelm Alexandria's defenses through sheer force. The Egyptians begin implementing last-ditch defensive measures that will either save their city or ensure that its destruction comes at the highest possible cost to the attackers. But there's something else happening that will prove more important than any military preparation. Young Cleopatra, now 13 years old and mature beyond her years because of everything she's witnessed, is having private conversations with her sister about the lessons that should be drawn from their struggle against Ptolemy and Rome. These conversations, conducted in the palace's private quarters, while the sounds of warfare echo through Alexandria's streets, represent one of the most significant educational experiences in ancient history. Berenice is passing on to Cleopatra not just tactical knowledge about military strategy and political maneuvering, but philosophical insights about leadership, power, and the responsibilities that come with ruling Egypt. The most important lesson concerns the relationship between personal survival and principles are circumstances where a ruler's first. Berenice explains to Cleopatra that their obligation isn't to preserve her own life or even her own power, but to uphold the values and interests that justify her authority. A pharaoh who saves herself by betraying Egypt's independence might survive physically, but she'll have destroyed everything that makes her worth following. But Berenice also discusses the practical realities of power in a world dominated by Roman military strength. She acknowledges that Egypt can't simply ignore Rome or pretend that Roman interests don't matter. The challenge for future Egyptian rulers will be finding ways to maintain Egyptian identity and autonomy while operating within the constraints imposed by Roman hegemony. These conversations provide Cleopatra with a framework for thinking about the dilemmas she'll face during her own reign. When she later negotiates with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she'll be applying lessons learned from watching Berenice's struggle against impossible odds. When she makes her own choices about when to compromise and when to resist, she'll be guided by principles that were forged in the crucible of Alexandria's siege. The winter of 55 to 54 BCE becomes a time of preparation and anticipation, as both sides marshal their remaining strength for the climactic battles that will determine Egypt's future. Inside Alexandria, Berenice continues to demonstrate the kind of leadership that transforms ordinary people into heroes willing to die for a cause they believe in. Outside the walls, Ptolemy and his Roman allies prepare for assaults that will either restore his authority or destroy the city that represents everything he's lost. But win or lose, live or die, Berenice has already achieved something that will outlast any immediate military outcome. She's proven that Egypt can produce rulers who embody the ancient pharaonic ideal of putting their kingdom's welfare above their own survival. She's demonstrated that even Roman power has limits when it encounters populations that refuse to accept foreign domination. Most importantly, she's provided her younger sister with an education in leadership that will influence Egyptian history for generations to come. The stage is set for the final act of Berenice's remarkable story, a confrontation that will echo through history as one of the most dramatic examples of courage in the face of impossible odds. Whatever happens next, Alexandria's siege has already changed both Egypt and Rome in ways that will shape the ancient world's future development. The final assault begins at dawn on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. It's as if Ptolemy has chosen this moment deliberately, timing his ultimate attack for when darkness dominates light, when hope seems furthest away. The sound that wakes Alexandria is unlike anything the city has heard before. It's not just the familiar crash of catapults or the rhythmic pounding of battering rams. It's the coordinated roar of the largest military operation the ancient world has ever seen directed against a single city. Roman engineers constructing siege towers that rise higher than Alexandria have spent weeks preparing for this moment. Walls, building covered approaches that allow soldiers to advance while protected from defensive fire, even diverting water sources to create muddy conditions that will make positions. Every lesson learned from previous siege warfare, it harder for defenders to move quickly between threats, has been applied to the problem of conquering Alexandria. But Berenice has been preparing too. The past months of urban warfare have taught her things about defensive strategy that no military manual could ever contain. She's learned that the key to surviving overwhelming odds isn't trying to match your enemy's strength. It's forcing them to fight on terms that neutralize their advantages. And Alexandria's narrow streets, complex building patterns, and maze-like underground passages represent the perfect environment for that kind of defensive warfare. Picture the scene as the Roman assault begins. Thousands of soldiers advance across the ground between their siege camps and Alexandria's walls, their shields locked together in the famous testudo formation that's conquered cities across the Mediterranean. Behind them, massive siege engines hurl stones and fire arrows at defensive positions. Above them, the winter sky is dark with smoke from burning buildings, and the dust kicked up by marching feet. But inside Alexandria, something extraordinary is happening. Instead of the panic and confusion that usually accompanies such overwhelming attacks, the city's defenders are moving with the kind of coordinated precision that comes from months of preparation and absolute commitment to their cause. Every person knows exactly what they're supposed to do, exactly where they're supposed to be, exactly how their individual actions contribute to the city's overall defensive strategy. Berenice herself is everywhere at once, appearing at critical moments to rally defenders who might otherwise break under the pressure, personally directing counterattacks that exploit weaknesses in Roman formations, even fighting hand-to-hand when enemy soldiers breach the walls. She's not ordinary people into heroes willing to die for something just commanding the battle. She's embodying the spirit of resistance that transforms larger than themselves. The fighting is incredibly brutal and personal. Roman soldiers who've spent months frustrated by an enemy they can never quite pin down finally have the chance to engage in the kind of direct combat they understand. But they discover that Alexandria's defenders aren't just fighting for military objectives. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their entire way of life. The intensity of that motivation creates a kind of desperate courage that Roman training and discipline struggle to overcome. Street by street, building by building, sometimes room by room, the battle progresses into Alexandria's inner districts. Roman forces advance because their numbers and equipment give them no choice but to eventually overwhelm defensive positions. But every advance costs them dearly, and every position they capture has been stripped of everything useful before they arrive functioning city. The most devastating aspect of they're conquering ruins rather than a Roman assault isn't the military casualties, though those are enormous. It's the systematic destruction of Alexandria's cultural treasures. Buildings that house centuries of accumulated knowledge are being burned. Artworks that represent the pinnacle of ancient craftsmanship are being smashed or looted. The Great Library itself, the repository of human learning that draws scholars from across the known world, becomes a battlefield where priceless scrolls are trampled underfoot by soldiers focused on killing each other. Young Cleopatra witnesses this destruction with the kind of horror that will shape her entire approach to preserving Egyptian civilization. She's watching Roman soldiers use ancient papyrus scrolls as fuel for their cooking fires. She's seeing statues of Egyptian gods being broken apart to clear fields of fire for military equipment. She's learning that warfare isn't just about political control. It's about the survival of everything that makes a civilization worth defending. But she's also seeing something else that's equally important for her future development as a leader. She's watching how Berenice maintains her dignity and her principles even as everything she's fought to protect crumbles around her. Her older sister isn't becoming bitter or desperated. She's becoming more focused as defeat becomes inevitable. Instead, on ensuring that her resistance means something, that the example she's setting will inspire future generations of Egyptians who face similar challenges. The siege reaches its climax when Roman forces finally break through Alexandria's inner defenses and begin fighting their way toward the royal palace itself. This is the moment that Berenice has been preparing for throughout the entire campaign, the final test of her commitment to the principles that drove her to rebellion in the first place. Her advisors present her with options that might still allow her to escape. There are ships in the harbour that could carry her to safety in other kingdoms where she might build support for a future attempt to reclaim Egypt. There are even some Roman officers who might be willing to negotiate terms that would spare her life in exchange for a formal surrender that legitimizes Ptolemy's restoration. But Berenice rejects all of these possibilities. She's not interested in survival if it means abandoning the people who've sacrificed everything to support her cause. She's not willing to flee Egypt and spend the rest of her life as an exile dependent on foreign charity. Most importantly, she understands that how she faces defeat will determine what lessons future Egyptians draw from her rebellion. Her decision transforms the final hours of Alexandria's siege into something that transcends military history and becomes legend. Instead of trying to escape or negotiate, Berenice chooses to make her last stand in the throne room of the palace, surrounded by the symbols of pharaonic authority that she's fought to preserve. She's going to die as she lived during her 3 years as pharaoh, as the legitimate ruler of Egypt, defending her kingdom against foreign invaders. The throne room battle is like something out of an epic poem. Picture the scene. Berenice stands before the golden throne of Egypt, wearing the traditional regalia of the pharaohs, holding the ceremonial weapons that symbolize her authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. Around her are the last of Alexandria's defenders, men and women who've chosen to stay with their queen rather than flee or surrender. The room is lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions, telling the stories of Egypt's greatest rulers. When Roman soldiers finally break down the doors and pour into the throne room, they find themselves facing not a defeated enemy begging for mercy, but a pharaoh of Egypt prepared to die with dignity. The fighting is fierce but brief. Berenice and her final supporters are overwhelmed by sheer numbers, but they make the Romans pay for every step forward, every life taken, every symbol of Egyptian independence they destroy. Berenice's death is both an ending and a beginning. It marks the end of her remarkable 3-year reign, the conclusion of Egypt's last serious attempt to break free from Roman influence during this period. But it also represents the beginning of a legend that will inspire Egyptian resistance to foreign domination for centuries to come. She dies not as a failed rebel, but as a martyr for Egyptian independence. The immediate aftermath of Alexandria's fall is everything that Berenice predicted it would be. Ptolemy XII returns to his throne, but he's no longer the same man who fled Egypt 3 years earlier. The experience of depending on foreign armies to reclaim his own kingdom has left him bitter, paranoid, and ruthlessly determined to prevent any future challenges to his authority. His first act upon returning to power is exactly what Berenice expected: a systematic purge of everyone who supported her rebellion. The death list that Roman spies had compiled during the siege become the blueprint for a reign of terror that eliminates not just active participants in the coup, but anyone who might have sympathized with Berenice's vision of Egyptian independence. Hundreds of prominent Egyptians are executed in the weeks following Alexandria's fall. Military commanders who served Berenice faithfully are crucified as traitors. Merchants who provided financial support for her regime have their property confiscated and their families exiled. Even priests who conducted religious ceremonies legitimizing her rule are removed from their positions and replaced with clergy loyal to Ptolemy. But the purges create exactly the opposite effect from what Ptolemy intended. Instead of intimidating potential rebels into submission, the mass executions convince many Egyptians that their restored pharaoh is nothing more than a Roman puppet who's willing to murder his own people to maintain power. The legitimacy that Ptolemy hoped to restore through military victory is undermined by the brutality he uses to enforce that victory. Young Cleopatra watches these purges with the same careful attention she's given to every other aspect of the conflict between her father and her sister. She's learning that political victory isn't just about winning battles or eliminating enemies. It's about building the kind of legitimacy that makes people willing to follow you voluntarily, rather than through fear alone. The lessons she draws from Berenice's fate will influence every major decision she makes during her own reign. When she later faces civil wars against her own siblings, she'll remember how Ptolemy's harsh treatment of defeated opponents created lasting resentment that undermined his authority. When she negotiates with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she'll apply strategies for maintaining Egyptian autonomy that were developed during Berenice's resistance to Roman pressure. Most importantly, she'll carry forward Berenice's vision of what Egyptian leadership should represent. A true pharaoh doesn't just exercise power, she embodies the values and aspirations that make Egypt worth defending. A legitimate ruler doesn't survive by betraying her people's interests. She earns loyalty by demonstrating that she's willing to sacrifice everything for their welfare. The international reaction to Berenice's defeat is complex and revealing. Roman officials celebrate the successful restoration of their client king, but privately, many of them are disturbed by how much the campaign cost and how little it actually accomplished. Egypt is back under Roman influence, but it's a devastated Egypt ruled by a pharaoh who's lost the respect of his own people. Other kingdoms that are struggling with Roman expansion draw their own lessons from Alexandria's siege. Some rulers conclude that resistance to Rome is futile and accelerate their own accommodation to Roman demands. But others see Berenice's example as proof that even overwhelming Roman power can be challenged successfully, at least for a time. The story of the pharaoh who chose death over submission becomes a rallying cry for independence movements throughout the Mediterranean. In Athens, the siege of Alexandria becomes the subject of philosophical debates about the nature of legitimate authority and the right of resistance to tyranny. Stoic philosophers argue that Berenice's willingness to die for her principles represents the highest form of moral courage. Aristotelian scholars analyze the political strategies she used and debate whether her rebellion was justified by Ptolemy's failures as a ruler. Even in Rome itself, the Egyptian campaign generates controversy that will influence future imperial policy. Some senators argue that the resources invested in restoring Ptolemy could have been better used for more directly profitable conquests. Others worry that the brutality required to maintain Roman client kings might eventually provoke coordinated resistance that could threaten Roman control over the entire Mediterranean. But the most significant long-term consequence of Berenice's rebellion is its impact on how Romans think about Egypt and Egyptian rulers. Before her coup, Roman officials tended to view Egypt as a wealthy but politically passive kingdom that could be managed through conventional diplomatic and economic pressure. After Alexandria's siege, they understand that Egypt is capable of producing leaders who will fight to the death rather than submit to foreign control. This realization will shape Roman policy toward Egypt for the rest of the Republic's existence. When Julius Caesar later encounters Cleopatra, he's dealing not just with an individual ruler, but with the heir to a tradition of resistance that Berenice established. When Mark Antony forms his alliance with Cleopatra, he's acknowledging that Egypt requires a different kind of relationship than other Roman client states. The rebuilding of Alexandria after the siege reveals the true extent of the damage that the conflict inflicted on Egyptian civilization. Entire districts of the city have to be reconstructed from scratch. The harbour facilities that made Alexandria the commercial centre of the Mediterranean need extensive repairs. Most tragically, significant portions of the Great Library's collection have been destroyed, representing an irreplaceable loss of human knowledge. Ptolemy approaches this reconstruction with the same brutal efficiency he applied to the political purges. Instead of trying to restore Alexandria's previous character as a centre of learning and culture, he focuses on rebuilding it as a fortress that can resist future rebellions. The new construction emphasizes military functionality over aesthetic beauty, control over creativity, intimidation over inspiration. The psychological impact of this approach is profound. Alexandria had been a city where people from across the ancient world came to study, trade, and participate in the intellectual life of the Mediterranean's most sophisticated urban centre. Under Ptolemy's restoration, it becomes a city where people come because they have to, not because they want to. The spontaneous creativity that made Alexandria great is replaced by the kind of rigid control that stifles innovation. But even Ptolemy's harsh measures can't completely eliminate the memory of what Berenice accomplished during her 3 years as pharaoh. Stories about her courage, her commitment to Egyptian independence, and her willingness to die rather than submit to foreign domination spread throughout Egypt, despite official attempts to suppress them. She becomes a folk hero, the subject of songs and stories that celebrate resistance to oppression. These underground narratives serve multiple purposes for Egyptians living under Ptolemy's restored regime. They provide a sense of pride in Egyptian capability that counters the humiliation of being ruled by a Roman puppet. They offer hope that future leaders might emerge who will continue Berenice's work of defending Egyptian independence. Most importantly, they preserve the memory of what Egyptian leadership can look like when it's guided by principle rather than mere survival. Cleopatra grows up surrounded by these stories, and they become part of her fundamental understanding of what it means to be a pharaoh of Egypt. She learns that true authority comes not from foreign backing or military force, but from embodying the values that make Egypt worth defending. She discovers that the most important battles aren't always the ones you win, but the ones that demonstrate what you're willing to sacrifice for your beliefs. The economic consequences of Berenice's rebellion and its suppression extend far beyond Egypt's borders. The disruption of grain shipments during the siege creates food shortages in cities throughout the Mediterranean that depend on Egyptian agriculture. The destruction of Alexandria's commercial facilities reduces trade volumes and increases prices for luxury goods that were previously available only through Egyptian merchants. But the most significant economic impact is psychological. The siege demonstrates that even Egypt, the most stable and productive kingdom in the ancient world, can be thrown into chaos by political conflicts. Merchants and investors throughout the Mediterranean begin factoring political risk into their calculations in ways they never had to before. The assumption that Roman client kings can maintain order indefinitely is shattered. This economic uncertainty creates opportunities for other regions to challenge Egypt's commercial dominance. Greek islands that had been overshadowed by Alexandria's port facilities start attracting more shipping. Syrian cities begin developing their own luxury craft industries to replace Egyptian imports. Even distant Britain starts exporting more grain to Rome to compensate for the unreliability of Egyptian supplies. Ptolemy attempts to restore Egypt's economic position through policies that emphasize short-term revenue generation over long-term development. He increases taxes to pay for the reconstruction of Alexandria and to compensate Rome for the costs of his military restoration. He grants monopoly privileges to merchants who can guarantee immediate profits rather than investing in the kind of infrastructure development that made Egypt prosperous in the first place. These policies succeed in generating the immediate cash flow that Ptolemy needs to maintain his position, but they undermine the foundations of Egyptian prosperity. Farmers who are taxed too heavily start reducing their crop production. Craftsmen who face unfair competition from monopoly privileges begin emigrating to other kingdoms. Even the scholarly community that made Alexandria famous starts dispersing as intellectual freedom gives way to political control. The contrast between Egypt under Berenice and Egypt under the restored Ptolemy becomes increasingly stark as years pass. During her 3-year reign, Egypt had been poor in terms of immediate resources because so much wealth was invested in military resistance, but rich in terms of popular enthusiasm and cultural creativity. Under Ptolemy's restoration, Egypt becomes wealthy in terms of tribute payments to Rome, but impoverished in terms of the spirit that made Egyptian civilization distinctive. Cleopatra observes these changes with the analytical mind that will later make her one of history's most effective rulers. She's learning that economic policy isn't just about generating revenue, it's about creating the conditions that allow a civilization to flourish over the long term. She sees how Berenice's investments in popular support and military capability, though expensive in the short run, created genuine strength that lasted even after her defeat. The religious dimensions of Berenice's legacy proved to be among the most enduring aspects of her impact on Egyptian society. During her reign, she had emphasized the connection between pharaonic authority and traditional Egyptian religious practices, presenting herself as the defender of ancient gods against foreign influences. This religious nationalism continues to resonate with ordinary Egyptians long after her death. Priests who supported Berenice may have been removed from their official positions, but they continue to influence Egyptian religious life through informal networks that operate outside Ptolemy's direct control. temple ceremonies that celebrate Egyptian independence become coded remembrances of Berenice's resistance. Religious festivals that traditionally honor pharaonic authority become opportunities to contrast legitimate rulership with foreign-backed tyranny. The underground religious movement that develops around Berenice's memory serves functions that go beyond simple political opposition to Ptolemy's regime. It provides Egyptians with a sense of cultural continuity that connects them to their pre-Roman past. It offers a framework for understanding current suffering as part of a larger struggle between Egyptian values and foreign oppression. Most importantly, it keeps alive the hope that Egypt will someday produce another ruler who embodies the pharaonic ideal as completely as Berenice did. These religious undercurrents will prove crucial for Cleopatra's later success in winning popular support for her own reign. When she presents herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, she's tapping into a tradition of religious nationalism that Berenice established. When she emphasizes her commitment to traditional Egyptian values, she's appealing to sentiments that were crystallized during her sister's resistance to Roman domination. The military lessons of Alexandria's siege influence warfare throughout the ancient world in ways that extend far beyond Egypt's borders. Roman commanders who participated in the campaign write detailed reports about urban warfare tactics that prove invaluable when Rome faces similar challenges in other territories. The siege techniques developed for conquering Alexandria are later applied to rebellious cities in Gaul, Germany, and other frontier regions. But the defensive innovations pioneered by Berenice's forces also spread to other resistance movements. The strategies she used for conducting urban warfare against superior enemy forces become models for other leaders who face Roman expansion. The psychological warfare techniques she employed to maintain popular support during desperate circumstances are copied by rebels throughout the Mediterranean. Most importantly, Alexandria's siege establishes new standards for what constitutes acceptable behavior during warfare between civilized peoples. The brutality displayed by both sides, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the destruction of cultural treasures, all of these represent departures from traditional Mediterranean military practices that will have lasting consequences for how future wars are conducted. The precedent established by Ptolemy's use of foreign armies against his own people becomes particularly significant. Other Roman client kings begin requesting military assistance to deal with domestic opposition, leading to increased Roman military involvement in the internal affairs of nominally independent kingdoms. The distinction between Roman provinces and Roman client states becomes increasingly meaningless as local rulers become dependent on Roman force to maintain their authority. This militarization of politics throughout the Roman sphere of influence creates exactly the kind of instability that Berenice had warned against. Kingdoms that had previously managed their internal conflicts through traditional political processes now resort to violence backed by Roman legions. The result is a cascade of civil wars and rebellions that ultimately contributes to the collapse of the Roman Republic itself. As Cleopatra matures from a teenager into a young woman, she carries with her the memory of everything she witnessed during Berenice's reign and its violent conclusion. But she doesn't carry these memories as psychological trauma or political bitterness. Instead, she transforms them into practical wisdom about leadership, strategy, and the complex relationship between Egypt and Rome. The most important lesson she draws from Berenice's experience is that Egyptian independence can't be maintained through direct military confrontation with Roman power. The siege of Alexandria proved that even the most determined resistance will eventually be overwhelmed if it relies solely on conventional warfare. But Cleopatra also learns that this doesn't mean Egypt has to accept complete subordination to Roman interests. Instead, she begins developing a more sophisticated understanding of how small kingdoms can maintain autonomy within the framework of larger imperial systems. She studies the strategies used by other rulers who have successfully balanced local independence with imperial accommodation. She analyzes the political dynamics within Rome itself, looking for opportunities to exploit Roman internal conflicts for Egyptian benefit. But perhaps most importantly, She absorbs Berenice's fundamental insight about the relationship between personal integrity and political effectiveness. A ruler who's willing to betray her own principles for short-term advantage will eventually lose the respect that makes leadership possible. A pharaoh who puts her own survival above Egypt's welfare will discover that survival without honor isn't worth achieving. This philosophical foundation will guide every major decision Cleopatra makes during her own legendary career. When she chooses to ally with Julius Caesar, she's not just seeking Roman protection, she's implementing a strategy for preserving Egyptian autonomy that was conceived during the siege of Alexandria. When she later supports Mark Antony against Octavian, she's continuing the struggle for Egyptian independence that Berenice began. The winter that follows Alexandria's fall is the harshest in living memory, as if nature itself is mourning the destruction of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Snow falls in Egypt for the first time in decades. The Nile's annual flood is unusually weak, reducing agricultural productivity just when the kingdom needs maximum economic recovery. Even the weather seems to reflect the political and cultural damage that Ptolemy's restoration has inflicted on Egyptian civilization. But spring eventually comes, and with it, the beginning of a slow process of healing that will take decades to complete. New buildings rise from the ruins of Alexandria's devastated districts. Young scholars arrive to begin rebuilding the great library's collection. Merchants return to restore the commercial networks that made Egypt the economic center of the Mediterranean world. Yet something fundamental has changed in Egypt that can never be fully restored. The easy confidence that had characterized Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia has been replaced by a wariness about the future that reflects hard-earned knowledge about the costs of political conflict. The assumption that Egypt's wealth and strategic importance would always protect it from foreign domination has been shattered by the reality of Roman military power. This new realism will prove to be one of Berenice's most important legacies. She forced Egypt to confront the limitations of its traditional approaches to international relations and domestic governance. She demonstrated that survival in the Roman world requires strategies that go beyond ancient precedent and conventional wisdom. Most importantly, she proved that Egyptian civilization is worth defending, even at the ultimate cost. As Cleopatra prepares to assume her own role in Egyptian history, she carries forward not just the memory of Berenice's courage, but the practical lessons about leadership that were forged in the crucible of Alexandria's siege. She understands that being pharaoh means more than wearing the crown and sitting on the throne. It means embodying the values that make Egypt distinctive, defending the interests that make Egyptian independence meaningful, and inspiring the kind of loyalty that transforms subjects into citizens willing to sacrifice for their country. The story of Berenice IV ends with her death in Alexandria's throne room, but her influence on Egyptian history is just beginning. Every choice that Cleopatra will make as pharaoh, every alliance she will forge, every risk she will take for Egypt's welfare, will reflect lessons learned from watching her older sister choose principle over survival, dignity over compromise, death over dishonor. In the end, Berenice's 3-year reign represents more than just a failed rebellion against Roman influence. It represents the moment when Egyptian civilization discovered what it was willing to die for, and in making that discovery, found the strength to survive even the loss of political independence. She may have lost her throne and her life, but she preserved something more valuable. The idea that Egypt is worth defending, no matter what the cost. That idea, that profound understanding of what Egyptian greatness truly meant, would live on in ways that Berenice never could have imagined. Because while Ptolemy XII sat on his restored throne, surrounded by Roman advisors and protected by foreign guards, the real power in Egypt was already shifting toward the young woman who had witnessed everything. Cleopatra was no longer the child who had watched her sister's coup with wide-eyed fascination. She was now a teenager, who understood that power in Egypt would never again be a simple matter of royal birthright and traditional authority. The world had changed, Rome had changed, and Egypt would have to change with it or face complete destruction. But here's what makes Cleopatra's transformation so remarkable. While other members of the Ptolemaic family responded to Berenice's defeat by becoming more cautious, more willing to accommodate Roman demands, Cleopatra drew exactly the opposite conclusion. She decided that the problem with Berenice's approach hadn't been her commitment to Egyptian independence, but her methods for achieving it. Picture this scene. It's a year after Alexandria's fall, and Cleopatra is walking through the rebuilt sections of the city with her private tutor, an elderly Greek scholar who had somehow survived the purges. They're discussing the philosophical writings of Plato, but Cleopatra's attention keeps wandering to the Roman soldiers who patrol the streets, the Roman merchants who dominate the harbour, the Roman officials who seem to have more influence over Egyptian policy than Egyptian nobles do. Finally, she stops walking and asks her tutor a question that reveals how profoundly her thinking has evolved. She wants to know whether it's possible for someone to win by appearing to lose, whether strategic surrender might sometimes be more effective than heroic resistance. She's not abandoning Berenice's vision of Egyptian greatness. She's developing a more sophisticated understanding of how to achieve it. The tutor, who remembers when Alexandria was truly independent, understands exactly what she's asking. He begins teaching her about the Persian Wars, about how the Greeks had defeated a much larger empire, not through direct confrontation, but through strategic brilliance. He introduces her to the concept of asymmetric warfare, where the weaker side uses intelligence and cunning to overcome superior force. But most importantly, he helps her understand that the greatest victories in history often require leaders who are willing to sacrifice their pride for their people's benefit. A ruler who insists on fighting every battle according to traditional honor codes might win individual battles while losing the larger war. A pharaoh who's willing to bend without breaking might preserve Egyptian civilization even while appearing to submit to foreign authority. These conversations transform Cleopatra's understanding of leadership in ways that will make her one of the most effective rulers in ancient history. She's learning that true strength sometimes looks like weakness, that real independence might require the appearance of dependence, that the most important battles are often fought with words rather than swords. Meanwhile, Ptolemy XII is discovering that winning back his throne hasn't solved the fundamental problems that drove Berenice to rebellion in the first place. Egypt is still caught between Roman demands for tribute and popular expectations of pharaonic leadership. The kingdom is still struggling to maintain its cultural identity while adapting to an increasingly Roman world. The royal family is still divided by competing visions of what Egyptian independence should mean. But now these problems are compounded by the damage from 3 years of civil war and the ongoing costs of Roman military support. Ptolemy finds himself in the impossible position of having to pay Rome for the privilege of being restored to a throne that his own people reject as illegitimate. Every decision he makes to satisfy Roman demands alienates Egyptian nobles, while every gesture toward Egyptian nationalism raises suspicions among his Roman advisors. The irony is perfect and devastating. Ptolemy had sought Roman help because he believed it would make him stronger, but Roman support has actually made him weaker. He's no longer just a pharaoh dealing with domestic opposition. He's a client king whose authority depends entirely on foreign backing. The independence that Berenice had died defending is now completely gone, not because she failed, but because her father succeeded. Cleopatra watches this deterioration with the analytical detachment that will later make her such a formidable negotiator. She's seeing how Ptolemy's dependence on Roman support creates a downward spiral that makes him less effective as a ruler with each passing month. She's learning that accepting foreign help isn't always the pragmatic choice it appears to be, that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. But she's also developing a more nuanced understanding of Roman politics that will prove crucial for her own future success. Through conversations with Roman officials who visit the Egyptian court, she discovers that Rome isn't the monolithic empire that most Egyptians imagine. It's actually a collection of competing factions, ambitious individuals, and conflicting interests that create opportunities for skilled diplomats to exploit. The Romans who restored Ptolemy to power aren't united in their vision for Egypt's future. Some see the kingdom primarily as a source of grain to feed Roman cities. Others view it as a strategic buffer against Parthian expansion in the east. Still others are interested mainly in the personal wealth they can extract through their positions as advisors to the pharaoh. These divisions within Roman policy create space for Egyptian maneuvering that Berenice never fully exploited. She had approached Rome as a unified enemy that had to be resisted or defeated. Cleopatra begins to understand that Rome might actually be a complex system of rivals and allies that can be navigated through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. This insight leads her to start cultivating relationships with individual Romans, rather than simply viewing them as representatives of a hostile foreign power. She begins learning Latin, not just to communicate more effectively, but to understand the cultural nuances that influence Roman decision-making. She studies Roman history, looking for precedents that might guide her own future interactions with Roman leaders. Most importantly, she starts developing her legendary skills of personal persuasion through practice with the Roman officials who visit her father's court. She discovers that her combination of intelligence, beauty, and cultural sophistication creates exactly the kind of impression that ambitious Romans find irresistible. She's not using these gifts frivolously. She's developing them as political weapons that might someday preserve Egyptian independence through seduction rather than warfare. But while Cleopatra is preparing for a future that will require unprecedented diplomatic skill, the immediate situation in Egypt continues to deteriorate in ways that make such a future seem increasingly unlikely. Ptolemy's harsh rule is generating exactly the kind of popular resentment that had made Berenice's coup possible in the first place. The difference is that now there's no obvious alternative leader around whom opposition forces can coalesce. The purges following Alexandria's fall had eliminated most of the Egyptian nobles who might have provided leadership for another rebellion. The military commanders who survived had either fled Egypt entirely or submitted so completely to Roman authority that they'd lost any credibility with potential rebels. Even the religious leaders who might have provided moral authority for resistance had been replaced with priests whose primary loyalty was to Ptolemy's regime rather than Egyptian independence. This vacuum of alternative leadership creates opportunities for Cleopatra that she begins to exploit with remarkable sophistication for someone still in her teens. She starts building her own network of supporters, but she does it so carefully that neither her father nor his Roman advisors recognize what's happening until it's too late to stop easily. Her approach is brilliant in its subtlety. Instead of openly challenging Ptolemy's authority or criticizing his policies, she positions herself as the most dutiful and supportive member of the royal family. She attends all official ceremonies, participates enthusiastically in diplomatic receptions, even expresses public gratitude for the Roman assistance that restored her father to power. But privately, she's having very different conversations with Egyptian nobles who remember the independence that Berenice had represented. She's not recruiting them for immediate rebellion. She's simply ensuring that they remember her as someone who understands their concerns and shares their hopes for Egypt's future. She's building relationships that might prove valuable someday, without creating commitments that could be used against her today. The genius of this strategy becomes apparent when Ptolemy dies in 51 BCE, just 4 years after his restoration to power. His death creates a succession crisis that could have resulted in another period of civil war and foreign intervention. Instead, Cleopatra is able to assume power smoothly because she's already established herself as the logical heir who commands both popular support and international recognition. But the Egypt that Cleopatra inherits is profoundly different from the kingdom that Berenice had ruled just a few years earlier. The damage from the siege of Alexandria, the costs of Roman military intervention, the economic disruption from years of political instability, all of these factors have weakened Egypt in ways that make traditional pharaonic governance almost impossible. More importantly, the international situation has changed in ways that make Egyptian independence even more precarious than it was during Berenice's time. Rome is no longer just the dominant power in the Mediterranean. It's actively expanding into territories that border Egypt directly. The Parthian Empire in the east is growing stronger and more aggressive, creating pressure for Egypt to choose sides in conflicts between major powers. But perhaps most significantly, Roman politics itself is becoming increasingly unstable in ways that create both dangers and opportunities for Egyptian rulers. The rise of powerful individuals like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar is transforming Rome from a republic governed by collective institutions into an empire dominated by personal rivalry between ambitious generals. Cleopatra recognizes that this transformation creates possibilities that hadn't existed during Berenice's reign. Instead of dealing with Roman policy as determined by senatorial debate and collective decision-making, she might be able to form personal alliances with individual Roman leaders who have the power to protect Egyptian interests in exchange for Egyptian support of their own ambitions. This insight leads her to develop the strategy that will define her entire career as pharaoh. Rather than trying to preserve Egyptian independence through resistance to Roman power, she'll attempt to maintain Egyptian autonomy through partnership with Roman leaders who need what Egypt can provide. It's a more sophisticated approach than anything Berenice had attempted, but it's also more dangerous because it requires her to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman civil war. Her first opportunity to test this strategy comes when Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria in 48 BCE, pursuing Pompey after their decisive battle at Pharsalus. Caesar is at the height of his power, but he's also in desperate need of the financial resources that Egypt can provide. Cleopatra sees immediately that this creates exactly the kind of situation where Egyptian wealth might be exchanged for Roman protection on terms that preserve Egyptian dignity. But she also understands that how she handles this first encounter with Caesar will determine whether Egypt becomes a Roman province or maintains some degree of independence under Roman hegemony. She has one chance to make an impression that will establish her as a valuable ally rather than just another conquered queen. And everything depends on her ability to project strength, even from a position of apparent weakness. The famous story of how she has herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet isn't just a romantic gesture. It's a calculated demonstration of the kind of boldness and creativity that Roman leaders respect. She's showing Caesar that she's willing to take enormous personal risks to achieve her political objectives, that she's someone who can be counted on to find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. But more importantly, she's demonstrating that she's not intimidated by Roman power in the way that most client rulers are. She's approaching